roundtable discussion around policy actions that are needed to advance regenerative medicine and cell therapies. We're honored to have with us 6 extraordinary individuals with extensive research in regenerative medicine, extensive experience as well, and we'll talk through who they are, but let me introduce them in alphabetical order. Dr. Julie Alexson, Chief Manufacturing Development Center Officer at Wake Forest Institute for Regenerative Medicine, Dr. Arnold Kaplan, Professor of Biology and Director of Skeletal Research Center at Case Western Reserve University, Dr. George Christ, Professor of Biomedical Engineering and Orthopedic Surgery, Mary Mullenberg Stamp Professor of Orthopedic Research, Director of Basic and Translational Research in Orthopedic Surgery, as well as Head of the Laboratory of Regenerative Therapeutics at the University of Virginia School of Engineering and Applied Science. We also have Dr. Keith March, Director of the University of Florida Center for Regenerative Medicine, Vice Chief Cardiology of Research, and Professor in the University of Florida Division of Cardiovascular Medicine and University of Florida Department of Medicine. Dr. David Pierce is with us as well, the President of Innovation, President of Research, and President of World Clinics at Sanford Health, Senior Scientist at Sanford Children's Health Research Center, Professor of Pediatrics at the University of South Dakota Sanford School of Medicine, and Dr. Ricardo Rodriguez, Medical Director of CosmeticSurge.net and member of the Regenerative Medicine Task Force for the American Society of Plastic Surgeons and the former president of the International Federation for Adipose Therapeutics and Science, otherwise known as IFAS. And I'm Robin Smith, president of the Cura Foundation and co-author of the book, The Healing Cell and Cells Are the New Cure. The goal of the session is to discuss areas that need additional financing and legislative support to bring safe and effective regenerative medicines and cell therapies to the marketplace and ultimately to the patients who need them. And we also want to identify policy actions that are needed to address this. I want to thank Janet Marchabroda and Bernie Siegel for inviting me to moderate this session and applaud the great work of the Alliance for Cell Therapy Now, the Regenerative Medicine Foundation, and the Cord Blood Association. Well, you can see we have extremely experienced panelists, but before we actually get into the questions, we want to engage the audience and start with a poll that we can ask you what you think as to what are the pressing barriers that you feel are addressing your colleagues or yourself that relate to bringing safe and effective regenerative medicine cell therapies to the market. I'd ask you to look on your screen to the Slido window, and the poll will be there. The questions we'll be asking while you answer are: what are the most pressing barriers that you're facing related to bringing safe and effective regenerative medicine and cell therapies to the market? 1, funding for clinical trials. 2, navigating FDA regulatory requirements. 3, designing and recruiting for clinical trials. D, manufacturing. E, workforce development. F, commercialization. Or G, other. If you would please answer these on the poll. I can see the votes are coming in. So in a minute, we'll have Janet share with us the results, and then we'll ask our panelists to comment. Okay, well, I want to continue as the votes are coming in. We don't want to stop anyone from voting. So maybe as we wait, maybe we could start. And Julie, do you want to start sharing with us your views, and then we'll hear what the audience has to say, and we'll continue?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you, Robin. I really see, and if we're just talking about a few things, I guess I want to touch base on both manufacturing and regulatory, and not to say that it's necessarily a barrier, but a challenge, and how can we improve on that. the manufacturing challenges that I see, and which have been mentioned throughout the conference, so you're hearing the same thing over and over, but you know it is really a problem, would be the supply chain. Really looking at the supply chain and how you're getting the appropriate reagents and so forth to be able to manufacture, as well as being able to scale up. These are challenges that we see in the field of manufacturing. In regulatory, I want to say that I commend the FDA for all of the help that they've given us through these pathways that they have set up for us. Interact, CAT, which is for advanced manufacturing, the RMAT pathway, as well as TRIP. So some of these give us feedback within days. Their guidance documents, all their presentations, Peter Marks being on the session today, giving us additional information, but to keep that going, because that is so helpful for us as we try to accelerate technology. So if it's two things I'm talking about, I would say manufacturing and regulatory, and we would keep that in a positive mode, so that helps people accelerate their technology.
Terrific. Dr. Pierce, do you want to share your views before we see the results of the poll?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I know I agree with Julie. I think something to just add to this right now is that COVID is really teaching us a lot. I mean, it's an unprecedented time, and I think the good news is medicine is going to benefit from this pandemic because so much has been put to this. And I think to Julie's point in terms of manufacturing and supply chain, we're living that right now. There are a number of clinical trials, where we are using cellular therapies to address the acute respiratory distress syndrome, and we've learned very quickly how to put that supply chain together in delivering those types of stem cell products to actually alleviate that part of the disease. So there's nothing like a see one, do one, teach one mentality with respect to that. And I think as we get through this. One of the missions for this group will be we'll sit down and say, what did we learn from the pandemic in that respect? Because right now we don't have the time to figure out exactly, the best practices. And not that the FDA is allowing us to get away with things that they wouldn't ordinarily, but they've had more submissions and we've had more applications in trying to address this, which we probably wouldn't have done if it hadn't been for the pandemic right now.
Right. Janet, are we ready to hear what our audience thinks? Okay, well, we're continuing to wait. Dr. March, thoughts?
Keith is in transit and hasn't been able to join us, Robin.
Okay, Arnie, why don't you go next?
So I can have a short answer for that question, which is that the structure of making judgments of whether something is efficacious or not has been structured by small acting molecules or drugs, and big pharma has structured the way the regulatory agencies review us. And so when the regulatory agency asks us for the mode of action of MSCs in a particular malady, this is a very difficult question because we put these cells into the body and we assume that if we get a clinical outcome, that the mechanism of action is X, Y, and Z. Truth be told, we don't know. And the mechanism of action is very important as we learned from Mesoblast's public hearing for their BLA on graft versus host disease in pediatric patients, where they actually had a very well-structured answer for that. And the issue is whether the answer was generated by the question asked by the FDA or whether it was part of their standard procedure. Most of us who are dealing with MSCs have an inkling of the mode of action. But again, truth be told, the MSCs set up a very complex, multi-modal cascade And it may be, for example, that T regulatory cells that result from actions stimulated by externally added MSCs are actually the therapeutic moiety that's the most important. So in this case, if we say the mode of action is the genesis of regulatory T cells at the site of injury, we have no way currently, no way of assaying that. So again, we scientists with various animal models and various other technologies have to add a definition to some of these mode of action questions. But again, structuring the manufacturing, as Mesoblast did, towards an answer to this mode of action is one approach. Whether it works for other diseases or not is yet to be determined. So I think the science of MSCs, how the status of the cell as we put them into the body, and actually what they do is the challenge and indeed the barrier for their future acceptance.
Great. Well, we'll come back in a few minutes to learn more from you on the MSCs. In the meantime, so many patients, obviously in the musculoskeletal area, want to have these solutions for their joint pain and their cartilage, degradation as they age and do sports. So, Dr. Chris, any thoughts on what you feel is a barrier?
Yeah, so I mean, I would check the other box. I think that, obviously every single one of those, I would echo everything that Julie and David and Arnold said, because they're all true. But I think we actually need to have these genuine conversations, which I think ACT has started, in which this symposium has fostered. And I think having those conversations will change the boundary conditions for how those different barriers impact. And I think it will lower some of these barriers. So I think just having the conversations, true collegiality, collaboration, and cooperation, I think can really advance this. I understand, on the clinical side, how everyone's overwhelmed with just dealing with the situation and trying to scale a very nascent enterprise into something that's going to take some time. But I do believe that just getting the conversation going in a very collegial, collaborative, and cooperative way is going to shift the landscape quite a lot and make all of those barriers achievable.
Terrific. Dr. Rodriguez, I know, we've spent a lot of time, and we heard earlier today, on the regulatory panel with Peter Marks and Dr. Califf's talking about consistency. So any of your views as we develop these therapies and we go toward commercialization on the application of administration to patients?
Yeah, well, as a practitioner, I'm at the point where the rubber meets the road. And as a surgeon, I know that the best way to deliver consistent results is within a framework. And in my own practice of surgery, our societies addressed that many years ago with the creation of standards for accreditation for surgery centers. And I think that ultimately the big funnel point will be getting these therapies to the public in a safe and consistent way. And the best way to do that is something that has been tried and proven, which is a system of accreditation for facilities that will deliver these therapies. With IFATS and AABB, we have already developed standards for accreditation for stromal vascular fraction, which is a very, very small subset of the total field of regenerative medicine. But I think that this is really something fundamental to establish a sense of safety for everyone practicing.
Terrific. And Janet, before we move on to our next question, do you have the results from the poll to hear what our audience feels are the biggest barriers?
Yes, I do, Robin. So in response to the question, what are the most pressing barriers that you are facing related to bringing safe and effective regenerative medicine and cell therapies to market? Our participants, 56% of our participants say funding for clinical trials, a common theme today. For navigating FDA regulatory requirements, 28%. Designing or recruiting for clinical trials, 6%. Manufacturing, 19%. Workforce development, 19%. And commercialization, 16%.
Wow. All right, so hopefully we'll be able to address all these in a little more detail as we move along. Funding, clearly, I mean, our audience as well as the group here, we're all talking about the need to get the funding in so that we can show the scientific rigor of the benefits of these cells and the applications for multiple diseases. Let's start with Dr. Kaplan. Maybe you can just share with us, I know people have participated in the day, but just share with us a little bit about funding for the clinical trials and what you see is really the key areas of what we know about MSCs and what we need to do to help advance the field.
Sorry, I muted myself. So I want to start by addressing. I need to get control of this slide and go back. Good. This program today, the entire program has been put together for the Alliance of Cell Therapy Now, Act Now. And the reason why we focus on public policy is that this is, although it's for example, MSCs and cell therapies itself are a nascent technology, they've been around for a very long time. So we've been working on MSCs, mesenchymal stem cells, since the late 1980s. I actually set up the name mesenchymal stem cells in 1991, so it's been around for a while. We started our first MSC company in 1992. The first product, MSC product, was approved in Australia in 2010, so that's 10 years ago. A second product was approved in Europe by Tygenix. The first product was a marrow-based MSC. Second product in Europe was a fat-derived MSC in 2017. And Mesoblast on August 13 had just a fascinating open FDA meeting for their BLA for graft versus host disease in pediatric patients. So what one can say about MSCs as just an example of cell-based therapy, not the only one, is that MSCs are safe, and in open label trials, again, not full placebo-controlled trials, double-blinded, MSCs in these open label trials with, as discussed by Dr. Q this morning, it looks that these MSCs can be curative. And again, cell-based therapies are very new. So the FDA has approved over 160 INDs for COVID, for drugs or devices or cells. So in the ICUs, it depends on which one of those is going to be focused, is going to be the focus of that ICU. And it turns out that cells are not top of the list. And again, it's because they're a new therapy, and they are a long way from becoming commonly available. And the way they're going to become commonly available is the financial support to expand this technology. Certainly, companies are going to go to the private sector to raise money, but as we've discussed today numerous times, the federal government is in many ways the main arbitrator of funding new technologies. And again, for example, for bioreactors for MSCs, if it wasn't for public funding, that technology would not have been developed as John Raleigh clearly documented for us. So How do MSCs work? MSCs can manage the overaggressive immune system by secreting molecules that can counteract some of the immune activities. They can organize injured tissue into regenerative microenvironments, really real regeneration. MSCs can make molecules that kill bacteria, and actually these same molecules can neutralize viruses. And I'll come back to that because it's hugely important in the COVID case, as is the next point, which is MSCs manage pain by secreting molecules that sit on opioid receptors. So when Robin talked about osteoarthritis and the fact that her knees are killing her, the MSCs in those joints actually can quiet those screaming nerves. And lastly, MSCs stimulate wound healing and inhibit scar formation. So in the case of COVID, and in a variety of animal models for disease, it's been documented that MSCs can be curative. And again, the first thing MSCs do is secrete site-specific bioactive molecules. But what may be doing the long-acting therapeutic activity could be, again, regulatory T cells or macrophage that stick around that site for your entire life. So right now, if you go to clinicaltrials.gov and you put mesenchymal stem cells into their search engine, you'll get 1,182 clinical trials now in play. It turns out that here's the map of the United States. The red states are the hotspots: Texas, Florida, California, and Minnesota, Mayo Clinic in particular. But here's the map when you put COVID trials into the search engine. There's 3,500 COVID trials. So it's clear that MSCs are one of many, many potential therapeutic outcomes. And when you put MSCs and COVID into that search engine, you get 55 clinical trials, 31 of which I've listed here. And what's important about this list is the MSCs come from dental pulp, the MSCs come from umbilical cord, the MSCs come from marrow, the MSCs come from fat, the MSCs come from a variety of different tissues. And there's even a couple of clinical trials of exosomes that are spit out by MSCs. So again, these clinical trials, these are the important modalities by which we can make a judgment of whether MSCs are going to be curative. So the object of the Alliance for Cell Therapy is to support regenerative medicine and cell therapy activities. And indeed, this group has obtained an IND from the FDA for the therapeutic comparison of 3 different tissue-sourced MSCs, one from marrow, one from fat, and one from umbilical cord, for the treatment of COVID and particular emphasis on ARDS. This activity is in the USA. It's multi-institutional. It's cooperative. There are no fights for who's going to be the head honcho or leading author of the paper and results. This is a truly collaborative and cooperative project. And this project now, after we've just obtained an IND, needs funding. And we will try both federal sources and also we will be very aggressive to try to find philanthropy, because it's another source of funding that we academics rely on. We need to understand that even if there is a vaccine tomorrow, which is not going to happen that quickly, 30 to 40% of the US population will not be vaccinated. Some of them will become very sick, and some of them will need other technologies, MSCs being one of them. So again, the whole concept of cell therapy as a curative technology is quite different than developing a single action, single site drug And the regulatory agency, Peter Marks in particular, fully understands this, fully has assisted us in the development of protocols and clinical trials. And from our standpoint, double-blind, placebo-controlled, rigorous clinical trials that are statistically relevant, have statistically relevant results, are the cornerstone on which all of this activity is based. So I think the Alliance is a unique documentation that companies, the private companies, government, and academics can get together to develop curative technologies, particularly for COVID. And although I can assure you that all the lessons we learned with COVID-19, we will apply those to other viral infections, and there will be other viral infections. So financing is the base on which all of us can progress. And so this is a personal plea as an academic to increase the funding for therapeutics. We have tens of billions of dollars being spent by the federal government on vaccines. We should be spending an equal amount on technology development for curative therapies. Thanks,
Thank you,
Robert.
Dr. Kaplan. Yes, I mean, it's a really good point. It's critical that we have more funding for therapies, just as we've had with vaccines. And in the policy perspective, with the election coming up, the tax code is going to be very important, that we don't make it harder for those philanthropy dollars to be there to help us move forward these therapies. I'd love to hear from some of the other panelists, maybe Julie. Just your thoughts on the difficulty that we're seeing at these, academic centers of getting the funding.
Yeah, it is a challenge. If you don't have some unique source, I mean, we look to get it from government, different types of organizations. There was MTech discussed, there's, NIH, DOD, but also philanthropy. I mean, that's definitely a big option. Or if there's some state organizations that like CERM or Maryland that can support us. But it is a challenge being able to get the funding, because it's a high dollar amount. And as we talk about the barriers, the cost of goods are very expensive. But as we move along and we have more and more people that are doing cell therapy, that's going to bring that down. And so we'll be able to lower the cost, but definitely a need for funding.
Thank you. Dr. Pierce?
Yeah, first of all, I think, the philanthropy side of things and funding these trials is obviously a necessity right now. So I'm really fortunate that, that Sanford is, put its money where its mouth is, the Marcus Foundation, the Cura Foundation, in moving the dial with respect to some of these trials, because, without that, we probably wouldn't have, some of these things happening right now. What I'd like to sort of emphasize as a tangent, which I think is very important, with respect to, just seeking the funding, though, is the fact, and I wrote a stat piece that was published just as COVID was hitting. So unfortunately, it probably didn't get the attention that it needed. But I think we need the medical associations to get behind us a little bit more with respect to raising this issue in terms of, cellular therapies and regenerative medicine, to getting support. And then the other thing is, and this is a little bit more controversial, I mean, this is a public health issue right now. We've all the bad players and the bad actors putting their billboards up with respect to that. Why aren't the politicians getting behind us? It's a trickle of attorney generals across the states right now that are starting to clamp down on this. But, the opioid crisis is the best comparison, not the most appropriate necessarily, but the politicians got behind this, and there was a call to action with respect to addressing this. Why aren't our politicians getting behind us with respect to mobilizing in terms of support? I'm a great supporter of Peter Marks and the FDA right now, but they can only do so much. I think he's done a tremendous job in really helping us, and he needs that to support, from the politicians right now. And that's part of where, and we've had this conversation with some of you on here, how we need to really sort of get behind that and act now. I think with what we're doing, is what we're trying to do, but we've just got to be a louder voice on that.
That's a perfect segue to the regulatory. I mean, the agency's really been incredible trying to help us not just, assess safety, but to help advance, treatment. Certainly through COVID, there's been a lot of interactions with the FDA and some changes to enhance innovation. I'd love to hear from sort of each of you who's been dealing lately with Peter Marks. What things have they done COVID related that you'd love to see happen post-COVID, that really can enhance these innovative therapies, getting to commercialization and getting to patients? Maybe start with Julie. Do you want to start with you?
Yeah, I'd love to. So we've had a lot of submissions over the COVID, since the pandemic started. But I can tell you that the ones that we submitted for an emergency release or anything that's been associated with COVID has had an immediate turnaround time. I was amazed. Something went in at 10 o'clock at night, and within an hour, somebody responded. They were 24/7. It was just so impressive. So how can we keep that up? I don't know how they could keep that up, because it has to be a lot of resources or these people aren't sleeping. But what I do want to see that they keep up is these pathways that I talked about. And I see that they are, where they're able to respond to people's questions within days. And this is more about what regulatory path should I be in, where people are confused. They don't know if they need an IND. And within a few days through the TRIP program, you can get a response. They've extended that now out to October. So I think that that's very fortunate. So I guess what I'm wanting to see is that they extend these things. That gives people an opportunity to ask questions.
So we need more funding, not just for the trials, but for the agency itself to be able to respond 24/7, 7 days a week, having those resources to evaluate these.
I think, Robin, one of the most important aspect was brought out by Peter Marks himself, where not only did he cleverly say we need more resources, and all of us, I think, Julie in particular, brings up the point why, is because now the response time is very fast, and actually that changes the way the whole process works. But Peter Marks brought up a really important point with regard to regulatory, is that he sees that he can provide facilitation of access to certain technologies and information. He can't share the individual pieces of information that each company or each group applies, because it's all confidential information, except that he and his people can ask the right question and can direct people down the right avenue by how they answer some of their questions. And Peter himself has changed the whole atmosphere within the FDA. And Janet Machabrota is to be commended for helping us structure language in the 21st Century Cures Act, which that language empowered the FDA to change their practices, and the FDA responded. So I think regulatory during the COVID era is mind-bogglingly fabulous. And what we'd like to see is the regulatory agency provided with more resources so they can keep up that level of interface with all of their activities, not just COVID.
Dr. March, would you like to add something to this?
Sure. Thank you. So I would very much echo what both Arnie and Julie just said. We've had the experience during COVID to pursue quite a number of INDs, several of which were emergency INDs, and the amazing response that we had, even calling one another in terms of some of the questions that might have been pressing on a cell phone with one of the reviewers, has been very impressive. But I would go beyond that. It's not only at COVID time. I already saw that we were pursuing 3, I believe, IND or IDEs prior to the onset of COVID. And the behavior that we saw was none other than excellent. I mean, there is, as everyone knows, a 30-day window to see what the reviewers from all the different specialties within FDA will say within CBER, clinical, toxicology, and so forth. And what we saw was after the submission, maybe day 15, day 18, we started to get questions that were forwarded to us from the project manager who's sending us questions, and we were asked to respond within a day or two. And we would do that in a timely way. And with multiple of those scenarios, maybe 10 or 15, by the end of the 30-day period, we felt we had answered them correctly and fully as to the best of our ability. And in each one of those cases, at 30 days, we got an approval. And I was just so excited to see that kind of responsivity. So it's very, very interactive with the various review teams in the agency. And I think if that will continue and can be bolstered, built upon with the resources that you were just describing, that will be wonderful. And it was really a great interaction. In no way was it anything but collegial. And I'm congratulating again to Peter and to the team that he has. I think he has 1,500 people, and he's shared before how complicated it is to have all of those reviewers work in a concordant way. And that concordancy and that it's driven from above in that case, and it's wonderful, I would say.
Yeah, that's a great exchange, and clearly that kind of dialogue allows things to move more quickly.
Right.
One thing that's sort of been challenging, obviously, these are very expensive trials, they take time. And the way it's been regulated is when you're using cell therapy, you have to do a trial from beginning to end per body part, if you will. There hasn't been a way to do multiple areas under one trial. I'd love to hear from David Pierce, who's really made some progress in that area, because I think it's an exciting, as you said, change in the agency. The ability to move trials a little bit more quickly so that it has multiple areas or indications for therapeutic development. David?
Yeah. Thank you, Robin. I think several of you know that Stanford has completed using stromal vascular in one early trial for rotator cuff, and we have a pivotal trial for rotator cuff tears now. And having also been completed interim analysis on a wrist osteoarthritis. And have other trials as well ongoing in orthopedics. And I think Keith sort of nailed it in terms of, how the FDA is, sort of really, the culture has almost changed a little bit, thanks to Peter, so because the conversation I had, I went to visit with him and said, we're advancing these indications of stromal vascular, so these stem cells now in orthopedics. Do we have to do a trial for every indication? I mean, we've proven safety. It's not going to be any different in the ankle, on the hip, or the knee, with respect to really the cell counts and everything that's done right now. And he helped, we went with a registry trial, and that registry trial is now, about to be operationalized thanks to COVID. Obviously, it's not something that we're ready to go with just yet. But that degree of openness, I think, has really helped. And, on top of the COVID and the great turnarounds that, everybody else is talking about now, I think it's really sort of, created much more of a collaborative environment between investigators and the FDA, and much more openness. And I would say, and we own some of that, because I think often we've been somewhat adversarial to the FDA. And I think that, it's allowed us to sort of dial back and recognize how difficult their job is, and for us to listen to them and put that together. So I'm hopeful now, with respect to cellular therapies across many indications right now. If you've got that one type of, stem cell or product, you'll be able to use it for different indications, because that has now been set in motion.
Right.
Very exciting. So I know we had a earlier panel on manufacturing, which was terrific, but I want to spend a few minutes, because obviously when you're having these trials, you get data, all of a sudden you're commercial. How are we going to scale? And manufacturing is a critical element of that. So I want to really talk about a few of the key areas that you all feel are really important for the, around cost and scale, and how the government may be able to support us in terms of both the manufacturing and the logistics around transporting products. So maybe we can start with Dr. Chris.
Yeah, sure. Had to unmute there for a second. I think, actually we got a lot of guidance, again, from the commissioners and former commissioners, this afternoon in terms of trying to understand what exactly the requirements are being and making sure that we go about this intelligently in terms of, quality control, critical quality attributes, and of course, mode of action and potency assays. And so, now that this conversation is open and everyone's actively engaged, I think that, and with the turnaround times, I think there's a huge opportunity to hone in on really what the requirements are. And Dr. Marks was open to that. He said, please talk to us early, talk to us often. Don't assume you know what it is. And, then you run the risk of spending a lot of time and energy working on something that may not be what they even need or would require. And so, I think that with the dramatic change in the way that FDA is handling these requests and the rapidity with which they're doing it now compared to prior times, even with gene therapy and some things Julie and I did when I was awake, this is like a sea change in the way that they respond. And I think it's a huge opportunity to really nail down what's important on manufacturing. And I think Peter Marks was pretty on point about that in terms of you're going to have that manufacturing process nailed down. And if you don't know what it looks like, then give us a call.
Julie?
Yeah, not only the transport, but the whole process of which I brought up before of being able to get the supply chain and being able to understand that piece of it and then scaling it up. And the other important piece I'll bring in is automation. And that's what we're really going to need to be able to get this out to everybody that needs the therapies. So I feel like that's a bit of a roadblock. We need things that don't destroy our product, so non-destructive quality control, as well as the automation. I think that's what's going to get us there. You heard John Raleigh talk about, getting billions and billions of cells, but doing that manually is a big challenge. If we get these big bioreactors, maybe that's the way to go. Somehow it's got to be automated, though. So I feel like that's one of the challenges that we're going to need help to move forward.
Do you all feel that funding could really make a difference, that getting the support from the government to help build and put some of these facilities in place is critical? Or do you feel that maybe, each group doing their own manufacturing is a better way to go?
It's a collaborative effort. I just want to say that. I don't want to take up time, but it's a collaborative effort. So everybody should come together to work on it because we need these platforms.
David, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm somewhat different, but the same. I think we need to walk before we can run when it comes to manufacturing and the funding. I think that in my world we're more point of care with respect to just taking autologous cells from an individual and just really enriching for them right now. And I think as we advance and learn from that, in terms of what the populations of the cells. I think Arnie always points this out in terms of the nomenclature of the cells, and we need to pay attention to that sometimes in terms of as he points out, what's the mechanism here? We're so focused on clinical outcomes right now, so I think as we learn more in terms of just the applications of some of these cell types, we can hone in on the specifics that may be what we need to manufacture. I don't know if necessarily everybody will agree with the headless guy that's actually on the screen right now. But what the healing or regenerative properties are in some of these, populations are. We haven't quite narrowed that down. So I think that, do we truly know what we need to manufacture in some cases? And I think that's a bit of a devil's advocate sort of position. But I think we have to be sure of what we're working with sometimes.
So actually, David brings up a hugely important point that's completely missed in all of these discussions, which is what is the response profile of the patient? And we've done some experiments where we put human cells into mice and human MSCs into mice, and we got a curative event. And when we tracked the MSCs by labeling them, and actually analyze them by picking them out of the tissue that they engrafted in, we find that the host tissue, was making 90 to 100 different proteins compared to the ones that didn't see the MSCs at that injury site. So our point of view is that it's the host who has the capabilities of repairing the injury site. And the MSC is sort of orchestrating some of that. And David's point, and particularly in orthopedics, we know there's some patients who respond very well to surgical therapy and some that don't. And Ricardo will tell you that in the case of fat-derived MSCs or fat preparations, they're perfect preparations that work in one patient and have problems in another patient. And so the response profile of the patient and the genetics of that patient compared to the genetics of the cells that we're putting in is an area that the basic scientists are going to have to spend a lot of time on and figure out ways of asking what's the potency of the cell in the patient, and will that patient respond to that potency? So again, I made the point that we've been working on this since the 1980s. It's still a nascent technology that requires gigantic amounts of innovative work by the scientific and clinical community. Just how you deliver the cells is
Right.
one way better than another way. Those are questions that we need to answer. And again, we're dying for the appropriate resources to do that. I think Ricardo can speak to that.
Yeah, it's a critical area. And I want to move to Ricardo for a second to talk about sort of the end or the final piece of the manufacturing at point of care and on the delivery. So it's a perfect segue.
So my point of view as a practitioner really focuses on just that, on the delivery. But echoing David, we do a lot of autologous therapies. And therefore, with autologous therapies, the best approach is developing a device, which in itself is standardized. And therefore, our problems are not so much of scaling, but of developing a uniform device or uniform standards for a device that will make the results, if at least not uniform results, will allow us to see clearly the difference between patients. So I think that there's a big market opportunity for development of a device, and there's a couple of companies out there already focusing on a device, such as GID, but that's at the opposite spectrum of the scaling and allogeneic therapies.
So let's assume we figure out some of the manufacturing. There's a lot more resources put there. We get the results and we want to get toward commercialization. What about the workforce? Not just from the physicians on the delivery, but the workforce to be able to work on the manufacturing and have those skill sets.
Yeah, I mean, there again, we come to the accreditation. I mean, these things have to be delivered within a certain framework to work. You can have the best tool or the best drug, and if it's not delivered by the right practitioner or in an unsafe environment, really, then all the work until the last 3 feet has been wasted. Therefore, the issue of accreditation and proper training of physicians, proper training of the personnel, development of indications, all of those things are really necessary, because that is the last step. And you don't want to travel all this way in manufacturing and regulatory approval and then, so to speak, fumble the ball at the last yard. So for me, accreditation is also a key part of this process.
Dr. March, any thoughts on the workforce?
Well, yeah, I would build on what Ricardo just said. Very much the physicians are critical that they be understanding of the nature of the product and how to apply it. But also behind that, there are multiple clinical aspects to that program, whether it's a physical therapist, whether it's the person preparing the cells, whether it's the bench scientists working through that manufacturing process that is so critical, and we've heard alluded to a bunch. All of that is still being built. And right now, you know, just in the sense that many of the facilities that are generating cell and gene therapies are essentially overbooked. Part of it is the people are also overbooked, and that's because the supply is still low. So something we've developed is a regenerative medicine training program that involves not only bench scientist commitments, but also a 2-semester program for undergraduates. So we're actually starting at the undergraduate level in an effort to bring forward that workforce and to excite them about the opportunities that are going to be and are currently present in the entire supply chain of resources, the cells, again, the manufacturing, the shipping, all the pieces of that, including regulatory, GMP, GLP, the good manufacturing, the good laboratory practices. Those are very much burgeoning areas, and they need workforce. So we're looking really hard at and have created a program with others to bring that forward at an early stage, the undergraduate into the graduate and so forth. I think we need to continue to do that as a country, really.
Especially as this paradigm shift towards cell therapy, we absolutely going to need that workforce. So you're absolutely right. That's the perfect age group to start getting people excited and having the tool sets to be a part of it. Julie, anything to add there?
Yeah, just that it's very costly because we do have to train everybody, just like Keith said. So they go through a training period, whether it's process development that's doing all of the technical studies to be able to transfer it into manufacturing, or the manufacturing folks. I would say it takes a good 6 months, but we do have complex products, not only cell and gene therapy products, but also the tissue engineered products. But it takes a lot of time and effort to train people. And if it's a younger group coming in, sometimes they only want to be there for a few years. That turnover becomes very costly. So any type of structure for workforce development would be welcomed in this area. There's also a lot of job openings right now. So they want people all over in this field. So it's a fight to get them.
It's critical. I want to spend a minute. We talked a little bit about philanthropy. What about partnerships? Because clearly, as you said, it takes a village. I think, Keith, you said it's important that we all are working together. And I think, Julie, you said that as well, to answer some of these questions, especially on the manufacturing side. Maybe, David, just a view on partnerships and how you see that impacting, accelerating regenerative medicine cell therapies?
Yeah, no, first of all, I think in workforce development, I need a computer scientist to bring my, to get involved in regenerating my head back. But
yes, critical. Maybe it's in the bioreactor making those cells.
Yeah, so my apologies for that. So, but no, I think the partnerships side of thing is very important. I think the other piece, in terms of the public-private, is as we think of, workforce development, it's economic development. So, getting back partly to what I was talking about, the politicians and the governmental side, let us not forget, it's really our job to point to the future of medicine, and guide where, by state resources can be put with respect to that economic development. But partnerships like those with the Cura Foundation and the Marcus Foundation and Sanford, where it's not just, combining resources, but it's combining spreading the word about these things. So another example is we have a great partnership right now with the Helmsley Foundation in type 1 diabetes. And really, when you get two organizations together, that it really have the same mission, it just advances that mission, so much more. So, I'm very fortunate that we have some of these partnerships that exist. I think that the one I can give you, which is a governmental one, which is Sanford is it's outside of regenerative medicine, but Sanford, partnered with the VA, to really advance genetic studies for some of its patients with respect to that. So I'd encourage all of us to seek those partnerships, not be afraid, because, no, the answer no doesn't cost us anything. But I think you'd be surprised when it comes to opening doors right now, how reaching out and asking for those partners. And that's coming from someone with a background in rare diseases, and nobody wants to fund rare diseases 10 years ago, but look what's happening in the rare disease field right now. And I think that's going to be the same in regenerative medicine and cellular therapy as we move forwards as well. That caution is going to become less and less with those partnerships.
Thank you for that. So as we're getting a little bit tight on time, I want to summarize, but while I'm doing that, we want to really be talking at the end here about what's important, what should the priorities be that we'd like Congress and the administration in the upcoming year to focus on. So if you could go back to the polls and talk about what you feel the top 3 priorities are, that would be terrific. And Janet, if you can open up the polls, that would be great. And while people are taking the poll, I'll sort of summarize where I think we are today. So what we've talked about is really a couple of key points. One is to increase funding for clinical trials for regenerative medicine and cell therapies to support scientific evidence development, to promote quality and standardization in both manufacturing, distribution, and clinical administration, to maintain and continue existing regenerative medicine cell therapies, regulatory reform, and guidance brought back that we've seen with COVID, and to help that with other innovations and programs that have been put in place by CBER, like the Interact and TRIP, and some of those other programs. And then that workforce development, really both for manufacturing and for clinical administration, so that when it's time to commercialize, we're ready. So Janet, can I ask you to come back and share with us what some of the top 3 priorities? Again, I think the polls are still coming in, so maybe just maybe Arnie, do you want to just talk a little bit and make? Or Janet, are we there? Do we have poll results?
Yeah.
Okay, let's start there.
They're slowing down a little bit, moving a little bit. So what are the top 3 priorities, Robin, for Congress and the administration in the coming year? Federal funding for clinical trials at 55%, funding for the FDA to expand its technical assistance, 67%.
Wow.
Lots of votes for everything. Support for collaborative evidence development or clinical trial networks, what Mark McClellan and Rob Califf and Andy von Eschenbach talked about, 58%. Manufacturing support, it's moving, anywhere from 43 to 50%. Folks are still voting. And then workforce development, 27 to 29%.
These are all critical areas. So I know we have, go ahead.
So Robin, actually, I want to pick
Go
up
ahead.
on what David said. David's in a fabulous position because the chair of orthopedics was also the president of the American Association of Orthopedic Surgeons. And that's a hell of a great connect with getting a professional society on board with regenerative medicine. And Ricardo, in the same way, has 2 organizations that he's involved in. One is IPETS and the other is AABM. But the issue is that this is from start to finish a collaborative relationship. And the start is with really good basic science, and the end is with really good clinical practice and everything in between. And I think regenerative medicine, somebody ruined my day and called it a nascent technology. So it's unfortunately not about as nascent as I am, but the issue is really how to keep maturing a technology which can and will change the way medicine's practiced. And I think that's the take-home message.
Thank you for adding that. I'd love to do one question. Janet, can we do one question? Just at our time. Okay, I'll throw it out real quickly. So Dr. Kathy Mitchell is asking about online degree programs, that they're very popular and accessible. Do you think a curriculum could be developed for the stakeholders in regenerative medicine, along with outstanding academic research and teaching? These YouTube video demonstrations are very helpful.
I do think so. We actually have made all of our materials so far taped at the time so that there can be asynchronous learning. And our intention is, in fact, to create an online learning opportunity for the workforce development that could be used not only at the undergraduate level, but multiple levels. I think that is a great opportunity, actually, and a good question.
I agree with Keith, but we need to couple it with like an internship of some short term, because they need to know what it's like to be in the facility and hands-on.
Hands-on.
Right. Well, we are out of time.
As a surgeon, I agree.
This was a terrific conversation. I thank all of you for your participation. Lots to think about. And as we end up heading toward that election, these are really important points. And it was just interesting as we came through this conversation, the consistency both from the audience as well as from our panelists. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Yeah.
Bye.